welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from. My name is Simone de Verkaert. I'm the Program Director of the Global Resilience Partnership, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on advancing resilience impact assessment. For those of you who don't know, GRP is a partnership of over 90 organizations joining forces to advance resilience, which is arguably more important now than ever. Before I joined GRP 8.5 years ago as M&E lead, I had been working on impact assessments for a while, and I was a bit surprised by the limited number of counterfactual impact assessments of resilience interventions, but also quite impressed and intrigued by all the work that's being done by the technical working group on resilience measurements and others in advancing this field. A lot has happened, not just in these 8.5 years, but in the past 2.5 decades since we really started in this journey, and many advances have been made, and we've all learned a lot. And not least of which that resilience building works and has impact. And as I'm moving away from my role at GRP from MEL into overseeing our innovation work as a program director, I'm thinking there's still a bit of work to be done. As a resilience impact assessment community of practice, we need to better explain what the minimum requirements are, what we mean by resilience impact assessment, and how it differs from regular impact assessments. And rather than getting lost in methodological discussions or minute differences on the definitions, what is this, what is that, we need to see where we can agree and provide clear guidance on that to practitioners, decision makers, and everyone else interested in resilience impact. I'm very excited, therefore, to be co-organizing this webinar here today with UC Davis and the Arizona Institute for Resilience. And I want to specifically thank Greg and Sophie in spearheading this webinar with me, and the many interesting conversations we've had over the past year or so. We also have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and they will introduce themselves in a bit more detail, but I will quickly share the agenda with you. The next slide. So after hearing from me, you will be welcomed by Ayan Mahmoud from IGAT. That will be followed by a presentation by Jose David Lopez about what's special about resilience impact assessments, and we work on that together with Diana as part of the GRP. Then there will be 2 exciting case studies. The first one by UC Davis, Michael Carter will be speaking towards the cumulative avoided losses metric as he has tested in Mozambique. And then we'll hear a second case study by Tengo International in northern Kenya, where it's a quasi-experimental study presented by Lisa Smith and Tim Frankenberger. Then there will be a very fancily named activity interlude by Sophie Japers from UC Davis. A practical solutions round robin by Collins from University of Arizona and Marouche from Hamilton College. And then we'll have time for all your questions during the discussion and Q&A, followed by some quick closing remarks if anyone's still up for that. Few quick rules of the game. Please, if you have any questions, type them in the Q&A box, where we can then either answer them in writing during the presentations or during the Q&A. If you have a question for a specific panelist or presenter, then please specify that. If there's a question that you see that you would like to answer, you can upvote it. Let me check if we've enabled that shortly. And then if you have a question that you would like to ask, you can also raise your hand during the Q&A, and then come off mute will allow you to, and then we invite you to speak. And if we've identified one of your questions or something you would like to answer during the Q&A, we'll also point you out. Now over to Jan, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so very much, Simone. It's actually a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon, depending on when you are. I would say this webinar comes at a very critical time when resilience is not just a technical concept, but a necessity for sustainable development, as you have highlighted in the agenda. And despite over 2 decades of resilience impact assessment and a growing evidence base, we still face fundamental challenges in comparing findings and translating them into actionable decisions. Today's webinar aims to address exactly that gap. You'll see the mapping exercise that has identified over 90 studies with a significant positive findings of resilience intervention, a clear indication that we are making progress, both in implementing effective intervention, but also in measuring their impact. However, the lack of comparability, I would say, across these studies limits our ability to build a coherent evidence base and extract generalizable lessons. The two case studies that we will hear today represent important methodological advances. First, the cumulative avoided losses metric presented by UC Davis offers a quantifiable approach to measuring resilience outcome in economic terms. This approach allows us to calculate benefit cost ratios that can speak directly to resource allocation decision in terms of policy making. Second, the Northern Kenya PREG evaluation demonstrate the power of comprehensive resilience programming and provide evidence for the exponential benefits of layered and integrated intervention. Both approaches, you will see, tackle the fundamental challenges of establishing valid counterfactuals, a prerequisite for any rigorous impact assessment, but particularly challenging in resilience context where shocks affect entire region. As we listen to this presentation, I invite us to consider several questions that align with our objective of identifying minimum requirement for resilience impact assessment. First, what I would call standardization versus contextualization. How do we balance the need for standardized metrics that allow comparison across context with the necessity to adapt measurement approaches to specific settings and shocks? The second would be for me about data requirements. What are the minimum data requirements needed for a meaningful resilience assessment? You'll see both approaches presented today have different data needs without me getting into further detail and spoiling the party. Third would be attribution in complex system. How do we attribute resilience outcome to specific intervention in complex environment with multiple actors and overlapping shocks? Fourth would be that's where I think the most of our conversation would probably be is about translating evidence into programming. How can all these measurement approaches better inform program design and adaptation in real time? And lastly would be about scaling evidence-based approaches and about what the institutional arrangement that would better support the comprehensive layered programming that shows such promises in the PREG evaluation. I can go on and on, Simone. I mean, you know how passionate we are about this topic and how far we've come. But please, I think I'll just hand over to you and then address any feedback and comment that come from the floor.
Thank you, Ariane. And sorry we couldn't see you, but maybe later when the Q&A is there. There you are again. Great to see you. And now handing over to Jose. Bye, please.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. As Simon and Ayan introduced me, I'm Jose David Lopez. I'm currently working as a postdoc researcher at Tilburg University at the School of Economics and Management, and my research interests lie in the space of environmental development and behavioral economics. So I'm excited to open this session by setting the stage for why resilience impact assessment and matters and what makes it unique. So this short presentation fits into a broader conversation with research and implementation partners, and I will briefly share the rationale of for a distinct approach that we've been working with Simone and Diana Leon. I'm going to show you some of the basic rationale and some findings from a global mapping of impact studies that we conducted recently. Resilience has become a buzzword in the development world, but what matters is what we mean when we say building resilience. So we must ask resilience to what, and how do we know it worked, right? So our guiding idea, we can move to the next slide, please. Our guiding idea is simple, but I hope powerful. So we're taking resilience as a well-being measure of outcome in the face of shocks and stresses. So it's not enough to show that a project worked in good times, but we need also to know if it helps people recover or even thrive after adversity. That's what resilience impact assessment is really about. So we borrow from traditional methods, traditional causal inference methods, we still need a counterfactual, and we also still need to measure a before and after. But resilience is only visible, I mean, in the making when a shock happens, or when a shock takes place. So imagine a drought, imagine a conflict, imagine an economic crisis. So in those settings, we can actually understand if households or communities are improving or at least holding up in the face of this crisis. So in order to measure resilience in the approach we're taking, we need to observe shocks in our data, and we also have to ensure that the treatment and the control groups didn't foresee the shock differently. That means, or that we call, named this our non-anticipation assumption. So in this regard, resilience impact assessment is not especially different from other impact assessment. We're building up from the causal inference methods that are traditional in this context. Next, please. So what we did in GRP, we mapped the field. We mapped the space of resilience impact assessment. We reviewed the literature from 2000 to 2022 across different databases like GAMI. We have 3IE. We found almost in total, approximately, 90 studies in, let's say, low and middle income countries or official development assistance eligible countries that assess the impact of resilience building interventions that the main, let's say, criteria, the selection criteria was that they were using a counterfactual. So what we found is like most of the studies focused on social protection, environmental management interventions, and also financial inclusion treatment. And also what we found that the common shocks in these studies are droughts, floods, and conflicts mostly. But let's say the reason that we also started to discuss why or how to compare these studies is the realization that it is hard to compare. So we have different studies using different definitions, using different indicators, and often then they don't account for shocks in consistent ways. So in order to analyze this resilient impact assessment in practice, we used a model to describe, let's say, under what conditions resilience is built. Can we go next, please? So this is the basic logic of the model. This is our intuition, or the intuition behind our approach. Let's say we have an intervention and we have a time windows for this intervention. This is like a traditional causal inference approach in which we have an intervention that takes place. We have data at the baseline, so we can observe differences or no differences, hopefully, between groups. And then the intervention starts and creates, let's say, differences between these two groups. And after the intervention started to show some effect, a shock will take place. And then according to the situation that this shock creates in the community, we can observe at the end line point differences between these two treatment units. So in this basic context, we only have two data points, the baseline and endline, as any traditional impact assessment study or intervention. But then we can, with this traditional assessment, we can define if this intervention actually creates some, let's say, resilience. That means that did the intervention help the treatment group fare better than the control group when the shock arrived? If yes, let's say the treated households should end up somewhere in this green shaded area. And if not, let's say maybe the intervention didn't build resilience at all, and then it might be maladaptation. That means that the differences between the outcomes and between these two groups must be somewhere in this orange shaded area. This is, let's say, the minimum required to observe is an intervention create resilient or no. We cannot by far disentangle if this intervention actually build resilience. We can only observe if these differences between these two groups are related to development, let's say, outcome or resilience itself. But if we want to make this more complex, we can move to the next. Thank you. If we want to make this more complex, we can add some structure, or let's say threshold, as we call it. And then we introduce this threshold by disentangle by disentangling the differences between the shock of the impact and the shock of the intervention itself. So in this case, if we have access to another set of data of observation from this household somewhere between after the intervention starts and before and after the shock, that could be both. We can understand if this outcome, the differences between the outcome in both groups is business as usual development intervention, let's say education, or let's say environmental management outcome that we observe. Let's say people adopted some environmental practices and so on. Or if these differences in outcome is more in this green shade area that we will call resilience. And why are we calling this resilience? Because it's more than expected from a traditional or as a, let's say, traditional development intervention. So we have these two thresholds, or we propose these two thresholds in which we have some household that will be in this gray shaded area, and then this treated household will begin to recover, but they remain at risk, let's say, or they're vulnerable to fall again back into, let's say, the previous situation. And at the end, we can move to the final one. And at the end, we can also add or operationalize the resilience as capacities. In this shaded area, there was different thresholds according to what we're observing in the outcomes. So just to close, I'm running against time. The final slide from this part. Thank you. So then what we are seeing from this mapping and from the model that we are proposing, let's say, we have a series of challenges. First, resilience impact assessment is doable. We know because we have 2 decades of studies that show that it works. We need to solve the fragmentation problem. We don't have common frameworks, so we are trying to come up with one. And we also face some ambiguity, and this is the question that are we measuring the true resilience or just general improvements? And finally, the idea of this also event is we must bridge the rigor practice gap. So how can we apply these methods in real world settings with limited data and resources? Thank you for the time, and Simon, come back to you.
Thanks so much, Jose, and for also helping me translate this drawing I had in paint into proper methodological framework with formulas and everything. That was great. Michael, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. So hi, I'm Michael Carter, professor at the University of California, Davis, director of the late great Markets Risk and Resilience Innovation Lab, and currently run something called the Resilience Plus Innovation Facility. So first, as a very quick introduction, I really want to thank the GRP group for pursuing this issue of sort of codifying what we mean by resilience and getting us to measure it more carefully. I think that's really vital. As I was reflecting on this, I was reminded, the resilience sort of reminds me of conversations I used to hear in the early 1990s where Martin Revalian from the World Bank was fighting with people with UNDP. What do we mean by poverty? And the reality is, while no measure is perfect, without kind of an ability to come together around what we mean by an important concept like poverty or like resilience, it's really hard to be impactful. I mean, again, imagine you have organizations saying our goal is to reduce poverty, but we don't know how to measure it. That's not a very helpful. So I think we should keep mind of those earlier efforts, and that while we can have our own reservations about, say, Martin Revalion's money metric approach to measuring poverty, the fact that people more or less came together around those measures, I think, has been very helpful. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the work that I've been doing with Mo Alouche builds on a plain vanilla definition of resilience as the ability to manage a shock with minimal reduction in current and future economic well-being. Obviously, if we want to measure the reduction of current and future economic well-being, we need a counterfactual measure of what current and future economic well-being would have been without the shock. So in the diagram there to your right, the upper or solid blue line represents the counterfactual who did not experience the shock. The lower or red dashed line is the households were shocked. And we can simply look at that space, and the area L are the cumulative losses, and the space labeled R, those are sort of the avoided losses that are available. So while it's kind of nice to be able to measure resilience, and we show how these spaces can be converted into a simple 0 to 1 metric, I think the real power of this is to be able to seriously provide an economic evaluation of the benefits to promoting resilience. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So again, this is just made up information here, but what this figure is illustrating is if we can imagine several different kinds of ways an intervention might promote resilience, and they're not mutually exclusive. But what Mo and I call type 1 resilience is illustrated by the sort of golden colored line. It's a faster recovery to a counterfactual state. So you can see that golden color line reapproaches the counterfactual more quickly. And we might think that could be interventions like insurance or shock responsive social protection, which don't have any immediate impact on mitigating the impact of the shock, but they do allow people to recover more quickly. What we call type 2 resilience promotion are those that actually mitigate the immediate impact, and that's illustrated, if you can see it, by the dotted green line. So that household is imagined to face the same shock as the red line household, but they don't fall as far. And that could be things like better diversification of economic activity or shock-resistant technology, so that when a drought or whatever comes along, the household does not follow as far. And then clearly, whatever recovery takes place, we can see in both cases that cumulative loss area has shrunk for either type of resilience promoting kind of activity. So we can measure that reduction in losses and create a benefit cost analysis based on that, as I'll explain here in my last couple of slides. So next slide, please. So real quickly, just to illustrate a point that I think is becoming increasingly relevant in my own country of the United States, where the current political administration says we're not really interested in development per se, but we are interested in humanitarian assistance. So this is just an example of, similar to what we saw before, we have the blue line counterfactual household that does not suffer the shock. The red line is the untreated household that's just sort of doing the best they can. And the green line is a simulation of what happens with the catastrophe level insurance policy. And the area marked G in this diagram between the red and the green lines, that's the reduction in losses. Now, suppose we say to ourselves, we don't care about development per se. We don't necessarily care about returning to the counterfactual state. We only care about holding people to some kind of minimal living standard, and we care about whether resilience promotion allows us to reduce humanitarian assistance requirements. So in this hypothetical illustration, and I'll come back to a real illustration in a moment, the horizontal line you see there might be a level of well-being, a level of income below which people become eligible for humanitarian assistance. So notice we could truncate, if you will, the gain and simply turn the portion of G that lies below the golden line there. That is simply a measure of the cumulative value of humanitarian assistance that's avoided by providing the green line subpopulation with a particular intervention. So again, I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind, because I think those of us who work on resilience have always done so, in the sense that it's a from an economic or public finance perspective, it's a money saving venture. And if we say all we care about is humanitarian assistance, then we can continue to address that using this kind of resilience measurement approach, and look only at that portion of impacts of resilience promotion that counts as humanitarian assistance avoided. Okay, if we could jump to the next slide, please, and then I'll quickly get to a real world example here. So this is just, not everything can be done experimentally, as we know, but nonetheless, I think it's actually quite useful when we think about resilience measurement to imagine that we have an experimental design. So what I show here is something those of us that do impact evaluations will be quite familiar. Here we sort of have two treatments. One is a shock, which is actually controlled by Mother Nature, so it's sort of a natural experiment. And if we have a resilience intervention that we can experimentally manipulate, then we can break a population up into treated and not treated. So we actually have four groups there: those that are not treated, not exposed, not treated and exposed, treated and not exposed, and treated and exposed. So if we think about this is really important. And what Jose David was just showing to us, which I think was really important. We have lots of experience dealing with imperfect experimental designs, right? And in his diagram, something he didn't have a chance to emphasize, but what was really important there, when we're not sure about, say, the random distribution of shocks to the exposed and non-exposed, we often look at pre-treatment trends. And that was actually in his diagram, which showed in that hypothetical case that the pre-treatment trends were actually well balanced between those who were and were not exposed to shock. So again, I think starting here, thinking about balance between these different treatment groups, even if it's not a full experimental design, is actually a really good way to sort of frame the question and look at the kinds of imbalances that we need to worry about. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to very quickly then speak with a real world example where we actually had exactly the experimental design I just showed to you. The households that were shocked in this 4-year study versus those that were not, they were well balanced. These were maize farmers in Tanzania and Mozambique. The treatment group was provided either simply stress tolerant seeds or a bundle of stress tolerant seeds with an index insurance that was meant to fill in where the stress tolerant seeds did not work. So if we simply start off with our control group, we had control group households, some of whom were exposed to the shock, some of whom were not. The blue line again represents, these are actually econometric estimates where we're just estimating, in this case, maize income on treatment, and treatment interacted with shocks and on shocks. So it's a fairly standard, exactly what you would do if you had a 2x2 experimental design. And what I'm graphing here is taking those econometric results and showing what happens. And you can see the L area, that's the cumulative losses for households in the control group compared to the counterfactual group of control households who were not subject to the shock. The cumulative losses are $1,443 over a 3-year time period. If we take the present value of that, that's $1,326. The CAL resilience metric that Mo and I developed is actually 18%, which means the households only avoided about 18% of the losses that they experienced. Okay, now let's look at the intervention on the next slide, please. So what the intervention did, as I mentioned, is already provide a bundle of stress tolerant seeds, which is really a type 2 intervention, with an insurance, which is a type 1 intervention. If we look at the green line here, this represents, again, the econometric results of what happened with the treatment group. So what we can see is when the shock came along in what we call period 0 in this diagram, the stress tolerant seeds kept people from falling as far, given the exposure to the same or to a similar kind of shock. And then we look at the recovery that follows. And we see that households in this group recover very quickly. And not only do they recover, but they generate what the diagram here calls a resilience dividend. That is, once farmers experience the technologies in action, then they actually double down on their investment. So we get what you might call, we actually get excess mitigation in the shock. So hopefully that's relatively clear. Again, the key focal point here is the difference between the green line and the red line. That's what gives us the benefit in the cumulative avoided losses are the result of the treatment, very well identified in this experimental situation. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Michael, just to alert you that your time is up, but so if you can finish up, then you can go to Lisa.
I'm almost done. So just very quickly to put the point on this, we can, and in the work we've written, and I think Sophie's been putting stuff in the chat. Thank you, Sophie. We can take this work and this measurement of the resilience gain, and we compare it to the cost of providing that, and we can ask ourselves, what's the benefit? So if we only consider reducing the losses but don't include the resilience dividend, the benefit cost ratio of this intervention from a resilience perspective is 6.6. That is, every dollar that was spent on creating the program reduced losses by $6.6. So a huge rate of return. If we actually value the resilience dividend, that benefit cost ratio jumps 12 to 1. So it's highly impactful. Finally, the last slide then, if we could go there. We take this same data and we figure out how much maize income is necessary for households in this sample to achieve a minimal $1 a day per person poverty line. And we can say, okay, let's imagine we have a well-targeted humanitarian assistance program that kicks in anytime family maize income actually goes below this 825 amount. And then we can sort of truncate the resilience gain and simply turn the resilience measure into one that is based on humanitarian assistance avoided. If we do that, it obviously cuts off a lot of the benefits of the resilience measurement because we're not looking at the benefit of putting someone back to the counterfactual or beyond. We're only putting them back to this poverty or indigency kind of line. When we do that, the benefit cost ratio is obviously smaller, but it's still quite hefty. It's $1.50. So it says spending on $1 on resilience actually saves $1.50 in terms of humanitarian assistance avoided. So I hope this quick and breathless presentation gives you a quick idea of why sort of fairly simple concept of resilience can be utilized and answer the kinds of questions I think we've all been very interested in answering for a long time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, and a really, really great presentation. Without further ado, handing over to Lisa and Tim, or Tim and Lisa. Whoever wants to go first.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Smith. I'm a senior economist at Tango International. This is Tim Frankenberger, the president of Tango International. We're going to be talking today about an impact evaluation of the Partnership for Resilience and Economic Growth in Northern Kenya, the PREG 2 project. Up next, please. This was a 5-year project funded by USAID aimed at strengthening resilience in 9 counties of the arid and semi-arid lands of northern Kenya. You can see on the map to the right. This is a highly shock-prone area. The main shocks are drought and flooding, conflict, and there are also a lot of conflict and economic shocks. This was a portfolio project, meaning there are a large number of cross-sectoral interventions implemented by multiple implementing partners, combining the work from NGOs, research institutes, and UN federal and government agencies. And the key strategy that was taken to bring about resilience impacts was called comprehensive resilience programming. And this is the sequencing, layering, and cross-sectoral integration of interventions, drawing on impact synergies from these cross-sectoral interventions for optimal impact. Next, please. These are the 10 cross-sectoral intervention sets in red around the circle here. They were in 4 categories: agro-pastoral, you can see there was livestock rearing, agricultural production, and communal natural resource management. There were economic interventions, you can see in the top right, human capital interventions, and then disaster risk reduction was a major focus. And there's many specific interventions in each of these categories. For example, the promotion of drought-tolerant seeds, livestock insurance, and early warning systems. Next, please. So we were given the daunting task of evaluating the impact of this humongous project. And there were 2 top-line research questions we were asked to answer. The first was, did PREG 2 interventions strengthen households' resilience? And that was defined as the ability to recover from shocks, and which interventions did that. We used 2 indicators of resilience. The first is called realized resilience. This is the change in food security over the project period. And the second is the percent of households resilient, those that were able to maintain or increase their food security. And we could have used any other well-being outcome, income, as Michael and Mo used, but we chose food security as particularly important in this setting. The second main research question was, did PREG 2 interventions strengthen households' resilience capacities? And these are the underlying determinants of resilience. Next, please. To tell you a little bit more about the resilience capacities, they fall into the same 3 categories mentioned by Jose David: absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. You can peruse here and just see all of the varied capacities that we measured, and then we were asked to find out how this project impacted them. And these were all chosen because they were thought to help manage shocks in this setting, 20 in all. Next, please. This is the conceptual framework we use for the evaluation. We start on the left with households' pre-shock food security. After experiencing a shock, they use their absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities to cope and respond. And ultimately, that determines whether or not they're resilient. You can see the same kind of trajectory that Michael and Mo were using for income here. Some households, you're resilient if you get back to your initial pre-shock food security, or better off, and you're not if you don't. Please forward. So what we were tasked to do was look at whether the interventions of this project impacted these determinants, the resilience capacities, and then also resilience. And the resilience capacities were seen to be the pathway through which the project impacted resilience. So we were asked to look at both to get the full picture. Next, please. In terms of methods, we conducted household and community surveys at baseline and endline of the project for a representative panel sample of 2,394 households. For our treatment groups, we looked at households that were exposed to and or participated in each of those 10 intervention sets. And then for the main impact evaluation variable for looking at the impact of the project as a whole was exposure to comprehensive resilience programming, which we considered to be exposure to at least 7 of the intervention sets that I showed you before. And we made this distinction between exposure and participation because they're thought to have, and we found previously that they have different impacts. Exposure is simply living in a village where an intervention was implemented. So that's kind of passive exposure, and then active participation is measured differently, and that's when people actively participate in these interventions. For the important counterfactual, we identified valid comparison groups for each of these intervention sets and exposure to comprehensive resilience programming using difference in differences propensity score matching. We used about 50 matching variables to address bias due to targeting and self-selection. And most importantly, we matched on shock exposure, humanitarian assistance, and baseline food security. And then we measured impact by comparing the change in food security, called realized resilience, and the percent resilient across the treatment and comparison groups. Now, we could have easily used a randomized controlled trial, but that wasn't possible here to randomize so many interventions. So we needed to use a quasi-experimental approach. Next, please. So we can't do a resilience impact evaluation without a shock. And while we can't pre-plan for a shock, there was no dearth of them here and over the time of this project's implementation. The population faced multiple shocks. So the treatment and comparison groups were very carefully matched on shock exposure. And we had two sources of information. The first was climate shock from this MSWEP database. It's a multi-source weighted ensemble precipitation database. And here you can see the rainfall deviation from the norm as it played out over the project period. And there was 5 droughts and 3 floods. So it was a very rocky period for these households. We also asked households themselves to report on the shocks they faced for 23 shocks, including climate shocks, shocks to crop and livestock production, conflict shocks, economic shocks, and health shocks. And from that, we created a shock exposure index, and we found that between the baseline and end line, that had increased by 54%. So this was a period of great climate volatility and escalating shock exposure overall. Next, please. Now, before I go on to show you our results, I wanted to just quickly show you a comparison between the approach we're using here and that used by Michael and Mo, the CAL approach, accumulated avoided loss. The green line is showing how far households fall and then the recovery for the treatment group, and the red line is the same for the control group. And that area G is called the resilience gains. If you forward 2 times, please, Simone. Forward the slide. So basically what we're doing is we're just looking at the before and the after without taking into account everything that happened in between. And I must say that I love their model. It's very elegant and really does capture what's going on in between as well, which is important. But we did not have the data to do that. So we just looked at before and after, and it would be really interesting to compare the results. And I think Michael and Mo can do that really easily. So what we looked at is the change for the treatment in the control group, and that the difference between those changes was what we would call then the resilience gain.
But we also did RMSs.
Next, forward, please. So I just wanted to point to a couple of difference in the data requirements for these 2 different approaches. For our approach, we needed to have the well-being data at only 2 points in time versus multiple for the CAL approach. And then also we needed detailed shock exposure data for all households versus they were identifying a shock and no shock counterfactual on that blue line there. And that may be difficult to find in all situations, to find some households that were not exposed and some were to a specific shock like a drought. So just wanted to point to those at this point. Forward, please. 1 minute? No, we just started. We're halfway. Okay, so this is the main finding. We found that exposure to comprehensive resilience programming had a positive impact on resilience. Our point estimate for realized resilience was 0.81. But it's more interesting to look at these differences here in the percent of households that were resilient. You can see there was a big difference between our set of households that were exposed to comprehensive resilience programming and those that weren't. 15.5 percentage points. That's a big difference. Forward, please. And we also were able to look at the synergistic impact of exposure to comprehensive resilience programming. Here we can see the relationship between the number of intervention sets and the percent resilient. And the red line is showing this exponential impact that we found. And the blue line is showing what it would have been with no synergies. And you can see that as interventions get up to the 8, 9, and 10 area, you can see there's a big difference there. So this is really one of the big drivers of that impact that we found. Next, please. So in terms of the impact on resilience capacities, we found that exposure to comprehensive resilience program had positive impacts on many of the capacities, as you can see here, about 10 of them. Forward, please. And then when we looked at, forward, please. When we looked at participation, we found that there were even wider and broader impacts. When people participate rather than just be passively exposed, it's a more powerful impact. Next, please. And then we looked at which interventions had the strongest impacts. We were able to single that out, and we found that these 5 out of the 10 had the strongest impacts. And David Jose, or I think it was, I was talking about being able to translate these findings into actionable decisions. And this is really important for figuring out what to focus on in the future. And also the ones that you don't see here, how to see if we can find a way to make them more impactful, or in fact, drop them if needed. Now I'm going to turn to Tim. We have 2 more slides. He's going to be talking about the humanitarian assistance averted results that we got. Next, please.
So when we tried to calculate how much humanitarian assistance was averted, we estimated based on the impact of exposure to CRP on its effect on moderate and severe food insecurity. The CRP reduced food insecurity by 10.4 percentage points, which translates into added 40% reduction in humanitarian need. Given 28% exposed, the mitigation of food insecurity kept approximately 7,000 households or 42,000 people for needing food assistance. If all households in the project area were exposed to CRP, 25,000 fewer households or 150,000 people would have been in need of food assistance. So it does have a big impact, as Michael was pointing out, in terms of saving resources needed for that. And finally, next slide, please. The key findings that we wanted to get across here was PREG had a strong and positive impact on household resilience to shocks. It increased the percentage of household resilient by 15.5 percentage points. It did so by strengthening a broad range of household resilience capacities, the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities. It reduced the need for humanitarian assistance. These impacts were achieved through a strategy of comprehensive resilience programming, along with timely humanitarian assistance in response to escalating shocks. And these 5 specific interventions that had the biggest impact were communal natural resource management, disaster risk reduction, financial services, market linkages, and youth and human capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa and Tim. This is really awesome. Handing over to Sophie for an activity interlude.
Okay. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I hope everyone can hear me. So just as a little bit of a kind of a stretch at the moment, we've been on for about 50 minutes, and just wanted to kind of shake us up a little bit before we head into a few more bits of discussion and our Q&A. So this is a little bit of a transition activity that we have pulled from the CalMetric brief that my brilliant colleague Sarah Sitz put together. And this is something that may be elementary, but I think really helps when we can kind of take a look at the data and look at a scenario that helps us kind of imagine or visualize what we're talking about. So here we have something, and we can run a poll as well, as long as it doesn't cover the screen, Ida. We can, go through that as well. So we have this, here, oh, hold on, the poll is in front of my screen. Okay. We have this scenario. So an adaptation program has reached some farmers in a flood-prone area. Most participants have adopted at least one adaptation strategy. This could be, for example, early maturing seed varieties, or they've implemented some field drainage improvements. The participants were also offered index insurance, which in this case is a high, well-designed and highly accurate version that triggers payouts when severe weather events occur. So when flooding hits, the farmers in the program lose less of their crops compared to the non-participants. They also receive an insurance payout. Seeing that their losses are covered, the intervention farmers increase their input investments in the next season, and in 2 seasons, they're actually better off than the farmers that weren't flooded at all. So in this case, there's definitely been a hint with Michael covering this scenario in a slightly different way. But if you could pull which graph you think represents this scenario, go ahead and pick your graph A or your graph B, and then we can kind of have a little quick chat about it, or I can kind of talk through some of the indicators here. Kind of as you're picking, oh, Ida is saying that hosts and panelists can vote. Okay, I can't skew the results. As you're kind of taking a look at the poll, just a few things that kind of reiterate what Michael was talking about, and Tim and Lisa, but we're looking at kind of the depth of the fall, right? So that how far are people falling down after the shock, and then also the slope of the recovery. Kind of how quickly do they recover? Does it take a long time? And we can kind of imagine different scenarios like the one I gave you that then trigger kind of a different depth and slope to consider, and that obviously affects your numbers, your gains, your humanitarian assistance averted, et cetera. So, Ida, I think probably that's enough time for people to put in their answers. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so not surprisingly, if you've decided to listen in to this webinar, you are, I'm sure, already quite the expert on resilience and resilience measurement. So that was too easy for you. Graph A is absolutely representative of the scenario, which case we see that the depth, those that had both the adaptation intervention and the insurance didn't fall quite so far, and they were also able to reinvest and improve their circumstances beyond that blue line, the counterfactual. So just another way of thinking about it and reiterating and kind of strengthening our ability to visualize kind of what we're talking about in with these scenarios. So that's it. We're going to turn to Greg and Mo, I believe, Simona. But if you're interested in looking kind of at more of these kinds of graphs and in looking in more in depth at the calmetric that Michael was talking about and that Mo will mention next, I did place the brief in the chat, the link to the brief. Great, thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. That was really, really great. And it's really nice to see that actually quite a lot of people voted for that and got the right answer. So major kudos for you all. I think it's first over to you, Greg, and then to Mo.
Great. Thanks so much. And just seeing who's online and listening to these case studies, I do want to just call out the elephant in the room, or at least one of the elephants in the room, which is the dismantling of USAID and the impact that potentially could have on our collective efforts to advance resilience and resilience measurement. And I think I'm heartened today by the number of people and the specific people that are attending. To say, look, we are taking a hit right now, at least from a U.S. government perspective, but there's obviously a commitment here to continue to drive this work forward. Both Mo and Michael's work, and I believe, and Tim and Lisa's work certainly was funded by USAID. And I even see a number of former USAID colleagues have attended this event. So even their personal commitment to driving this work forward speaks volumes to how important we all find this. But I also makes me reflect on how far we've actually come and how compelling those two case studies were. So let's go to the next slide and not belabor that point too much. All right, so riffing a little bit on the work that I've been doing with Tango over the last decade on resilience measurement, specifically work on recurrent monitoring systems. We've been working with Tango and a group here at the University of Arizona. I am a research professor in the Arizona Institute for Resilience. There's a lab within that institute called the International Resilience Lab, led by my colleague, Zach Guido, who's been working with some other colleagues on developing this dynamic and adaptive resilience trajectories survey. Next slide. And the basic idea is that we continue with these high frequency recurrent surveys, collecting the same data from the same households over time, but that we can actually use a broad array of stress indicators. And we're looking at a number of different ones in collaboration with different partners. The Coping Strategies Index, the Food Consumption Index, which is something the World Food Program uses, Household Hunger Score, the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, and a modified household level integrated phase classification indicator that Tango and the University of Arizona have developed as a way to measure averted humanitarian need. And the idea is not only can you apply this approach to each of those indicators, not in the sense of an impact evaluation, but in a sense of getting a sense of progress being made. We can actually look across these indicators by not comparing indicator values, but by comparing their trajectories. So the idea is that we're producing a novel trajectory indicator based on existing stress indicators. And it's already come up in the presentation so far. What we're talking about is not simply linear trajectories of people getting better or people getting worse, but these trajectories of people taking a hit and recovering or taking a hit and not recovering. And this is really trying to understand what explains why households are headed on these different trajectories. And we're trying to do it in a very light and cost-effective way. This was originally designed in relation to humanitarian funded or emergency funded resilience interventions. I think it has broader utility, but the idea of a light tool that can be implemented after a baseline collects broader data, but using a 5 to 10 minute survey every quarter or so, or in reaction to a shock event to capture these different trajectories in relation to shock events. One of the things that's really important about this and building off work that Andre Mershon, who's in the attendees group here, helped me and others work on in 2016, is the use of triggered qualitative inquiry. In other words, we establish a trajectory with multiple data points and in real time trigger tailored questions to the different trajectories that people are on. And I think Peter Goebbels and maybe some other people asked a question in the chat. What about more subjective measures or something like this? And here we're combining the quantitative measure, objective measure of what's happening to these stress indicators, but it's triggering a set of qualitative questions to dig deeper into people's own perceptions, their subjective perceptions about why they're on the trajectory they're on, why they failed to recover, why they did recover, not only looking at the impact of interventions, but the impact of the broader change dynamics that are happening around them. Sometimes we'd like to attribute something to an intervention when in fact it has more to do with somebody having a relative in Nairobi or Ottawa and remitting resources to them. So the whole idea is to get what are the broader set of change dynamics and what is the role of interventions and their impacts within that broader change dynamic. And then kind of in line with what both Michael and Lisa and Tim spoke to, we can look at this in relation to humanitarian need. And Michael's point is very salient. There is, at least on paper, a commitment by the current administration to sustain life-saving humanitarian support. There's all sorts of reports of whether that's actually happening or not. But the bottom line is true. In addition to all the other reasons, dignity, people's agency, our own commitment to humanitarian work on why we should be investing in resilience, there is a bottom line here that it is in fact cheaper to do so, as evidenced by the two case studies. On this trajectories approach, we intend to also apply to that threshold to be able to estimate the averted humanitarian needs as a result of interventions. Anyway, the point here today was just to tease this idea and let you know we're working on it. Look forward to discussing more with any of you that are interested. And I think we're going to Mo now. Mo.
Thank you, Greg. So I just wanted to add a little bit to the conversation. A lot of the times when we've been presenting our work, we've gotten some pushback a little bit on sort of needing high frequency data and what are the data needs of these things. And I see that a lot of people are already sort of thinking about this and working on it and how to get sort of more high frequency data that'll allow us to measure resilience with a little bit more accuracy. But I just want to highlight some work that's actually already done through, for example, surveys like the Living Standards Measurement Study at the World Bank, the LSMS studies, and they have already not as high frequency as perhaps we ideally want, but they do have longer panels and panels where they do actually go interview people specifically after shocks. And so we've been working with the team there on using the existing data to use the existing data to measure resilience effectively, but also learning from what we already have on what we actually would need to do this in an ideal way. And we've been working with them on potentially developing and experimenting with ways to get more high frequency data that allow us to build on the work all of us are doing and be able to measure this concept a little bit more accurately and fulfills a lot of the goals that we are thinking about here and discussing. I think that, yeah, I don't have anything specifically prepared, but I just wanted to plug that and talk about uh, or put that in as something we could potentially talk about in a discussion on what are the data needs going forward, because I think that improving sort of hand-in-hand measurement, having a concept that we want to measure, but also the data that we get to measure that effectively is important. So that's it.
Thank you, Mo. And I see Lisa and Tim has their hand up and might want to respond, and I want to thank you both.
Full sample. We only
yeah.
had
Lisa, do you want to
about
go?
30.
So
We can hear you already.
just a comment on the impact evaluations that we carried out, particularly the one in Prague. We did have a recurrent monitoring system in place that collected data every three rounds a year, and that was done for 2 years. So we were collecting more frequent data, but that was to kind of monitor how people were doing with different shocks that they were exposed to and what their food security situation changed over time.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining that. And thanks, Greg, also for your intervention and for addressing the elephant in the room. And I think reminding us all also of one of the other criteria of any impact assessment, which is that we need to do mixed methods. We shouldn't just rely on quantitative. We should not rely on qualitative only, but also not only on quantitative methods. Let me see, I've never really done a webinar moderation, but we have 3 questions in the Q&A, which we can answer live, but people can also raise their hands, and then we can ask you to unmute and ask your questions and point it at a specific speaker or panelist. No, we don't have any raised hands yet, so I'm just gonna point the first question from an anonymous attendee, who I can also not ask to answer it live unless anonymous person, please come forward. But this is for you, Michael. You mentioned that the resilience losses can provide a better angle to a benefit cost ratio. How do you measure this aspect of resilience? You also put it in the chat.
Okay. Shall I go ahead and speak to that now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So again, the idea is and the time frame is important here. When Mo and I sort of superscript our measure by the number of time frames post shock, right? Ideally, we'd like to keep going and going and going and eventually see what happens. But we don't always have that luxury. So that's why we sort of call attention to the number of time frames. But again, the core idea of the losses avoided is comparing comparing the shocked household to a measure or a counterfactual measure of where they would have been without the shock. And so if we observe those over a time frame, we can simply add those up over time. We can take their discounted present value if we want to get the present value of those losses. And then to measure the effectiveness of resilience in a quantitative sense, which again, I think I'm an economist, so I sort of have a numbers thing bias, if you will. But I think it is really very, very important. I mean, this goes back to conversations I had with Greg about 15 years ago, probably, sort of this desire to be able to give a number that makes the point. And I don't think we should overlook how important that is. So again, if we can measure where people are compared with where they would have been without the shock, then we can do that for various kinds of treatment interventions. Then we're on our way then to be able to make statements like, yeah, you can actually save money in the usual public finance kind of metric. So I hope I answered that clearly.
Yes, very clearly, Michael. And I think, Greg, you might want to come in as well, if you raise your hand.
Just on top of that, I do want to point out an important distinction from the early days where we were sort of modeling based on a broad set of assumptions what savings we might get out of investing in resilience in terms of averted humanitarian need versus where we are now, which is actually using empirical data to make statements on what's been averted. And that's a really important distinction that differentiates, I don't know why I'm blurry, but differentiates work we've done in the past with this empirical work that really makes these clear statements. And then the only other point I'd add is different numbers matter to different people. Humanitarian need matters to those providing often, but not always, external humanitarian assistance. So this resonated very much, at least back in the day, with both sides of the aisle in the U.S. Congress. Not so sure today, but it did at one point. But when you're talking about local policymakers, sometimes averted economic losses and things like that can matter more. So it's just we shouldn't get too myopic on the humanitarian need. It speaks to a certain audience, but these numbers in general of what we're saving are really important, but know your audience on that one. Over.
Thank you. I'm going to Ken so much after I have posed a question to Lisa and Tim, so you can prepare for coming next. Lisa and Tim, the question I have for you in the chat from, again, an anonymous attendee is, have you perhaps managed running any subgroup analysis or heterogeneity analysis to see how the impact, things are shifting, how the impacts vary depending on different population characteristics in your treated area? If yes, what were some key bullet points that you think may be worth sharing? Thank you. It's also in the Q&A if you want to see it.
I don't think we can see the Q&A. Well, yes, we might be able to. But it was about whether different socioeconomic groups, we can get the impact broken down by different groups. That would be incredible if we could, and we'd have to have a much, much larger sample to do so. So no, we weren't able to. We've been able to break it down by poor, non-poor in a past impact evaluation. But this one, we just simply didn't have a large enough sample size. So no, the answer is no. Thank you.
I was very impressed. I managed to say heterogeneity, but anyway. Ken, over to you.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So first of all, thanks to all the speakers. These were really exciting and I think presentations that take us further on. I wanted to test my understanding of where we've gotten to and get reactions to my takeaway. That's a general question. And then I've got a specific question for Michael and Mo. My general takeaway is I understand that what's being presented here is saying impact assessment of resilience is really just impact assessment of interventions in shock-prone areas, with the potential to disaggregate how those interventions work under more or less shocky conditions or more or less severe shocks. Because I think one of the great things, especially about the work that Michael and Mo have done, is that it's a unified picture that resilience is not different from poverty in some general sense. We're talking about welfare of people under different situations and how that welfare evolves. So and a reason I think that's important is that, as you know, the funding environment is hung up on things that you can label as resilience interventions as opposed to things that you can't. But this puts everything on a level playing field, so that when Lisa and Tim say that market linkages and human capital are really important for resilience, those things aren't kind of stamped as resilience specific, but you're able to measure their impact. So that's my general statement. And my specific question for Michael and Mo is, tell me why it's interesting to have the zero resilience line. I think that the actual counterfactual line is much more interesting and policy relevant than the zero resilience line, which is not an actual counterfactual.
Okay. Would you like I can say just a couple of things, and then Mo, maybe you want to hop in on the latter part if you wish. But yeah, so thanks, Ken. I would just add one thing. Let me give you an example. So we just finished up an impact evaluation in the same area that Lisa and Tim were looking at in the Prague area. So it's a graduation program, builds women's assets. So we can look at that. We can look at the impact of shocks. And so what we see is that the pure graduation program actually does not. So graduation programs, if you're not familiar with the lingo, are programs that build up the assets typically of very poor women. So we track that over time. Women whose families experience these severe shocks, basically the graduation program impact goes away. Okay. Now we had a cross randomization with an insurance intervention, right? And what we see is the insurance intervention actually allows it sustains the impacts of the program even in the face of shocks. So while this kind of evaluation is sort of like any old impact evaluation, I think the specific focus is the add-ons, the things we might do specifically to make sure that resilience is promoted. In the case I just mentioned, the thing that's specially done is actually the provision of insurance, and we show that that actually sustains or makes resilient the core intervention, which was actually an asset transfer program to really poor women. So they are very similar, but I think the thing that's really exciting is that this other work, which we haven't quite written up yet, but we've got most of the analysis done, is we show that actually the returns to providing the insurance is incredibly impactful because the underlying program for women who were not shocked was very impactful. So we're actually sustaining or making that kind of intervention actually resilient. The zero resilience line, and Mo, maybe you want to add on here. I mean, it's actually just a convenient normalization. When we get down to the resilience gain, that actually all disappears from the calculation. So you're exactly right. The key part is the comparison between sort of the actual data. The zero resilience line is just a normalization that allows us to talk about that. But Mo, maybe you want to add in something.
No, exactly right. It's just a normalization so that we can get a number that sort of signifies resilience. But you could just as easily use zero, just right, a complete collapse to zero income as another normalization line, which is something that we discuss in the paper. But it is an important point is that that zero resilience line adds sort of something else that you need to figure out as another counterfactual, if you will. But so definitely point taken.
Thank you. And I see Lisa and Tim, you want to respond as well to Ken's points?
Yeah, just a comment on Ken's comment. I think what's important our study showed was that it was the accumulative effect of multiple interventions that enabled people to manage these shocks more effectively, much like what Michael was saying. It wasn't just one intervention that enabled them to manage the shock. It was certain interventions were better at helping them manage shocks than others, and it was the combination of those that made a huge difference. And so I think that it's slightly different than just a normal impact evaluation, because if you were just measuring poverty without any shocks, yes, it probably would be similar. But the fact is that shocks increased by 54% in that area or the time frame, and these combinations of things was what really enabled these households to be able to manage through that. So I think that's what's important here.
Thank you, Tim. I have two questions from Dina Sayed. Dina, would you want to come online and or live, as it's called, and ask them yourself? I think you might need to raise your hand though to be able to unmute you. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, technology is working. Go ahead.
So I was panicking when you said come online and ask them yourself. I wasn't sure how I would do that. Thank you all for this really insightful webinar. It's been great to hear the range of evidence that you've all presented. I think my first question was actually related to the exercise or sort of the two charts, but it's a broader question on timelines for evidence and whether there are relapses or shocks on a longitudinal basis. So do we see a regression if we study things for longer periods of time? But the second question was one really about the elephant in the room of the shrinking funding environment. So how do we protect, expand, and scale financing that's directed towards anticipatory action and resilience? I'd be curious to hear your reading of the political economy and the way in which it's shifting, and how major funders are retreating from not just a humanitarian response itself, but why would they care to fund the reduction of that risk? So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about this, and especially in the context of how it may support or enable community-based financing mechanisms, and localized financing mechanisms to support and enable some of this scaling and expansion of anticipatory action.
Greg, I think your hand is up first.
Yeah, I'll respond to the second one because it's more in my lane. But I do think, and Andre Mershon made the point in the chat, he's currently in Zambia. And certainly in places like Kenya, this is true. Governments have been, even prior to recent happenings in the US, UK, and elsewhere, governments in places like Kenya have been stemming up and making major investments in areas traditionally left to external humanitarian response, like northern Kenya. So that PREG program that Tim and Lisa spoke to is actually embedded within a broader Ending Drought Emergencies initiative. And they're under extreme pressure 8, 10 years into that set of investments to demonstrate the exact type of evidence we're talking about now. I mean, if they were able to quantify in the way that both Michael and Mo have, and Lisa and Tim have, around those specific intervention sets for the broader Ending Drought Emergencies initiative, they'd be well financed to continue that work going forward. But they're really at an inflection point, and I think USA and others were supporting the government of Kenya, but it was government of Kenya clearly in the lead. And so they're clamoring for this type of evidence and support around their specific policy and investments. I think the challenge is how do we connect the dots on these approaches that are developed on, yes, multi-sectoral interventions, but on a fairly small scale to these large-scale investments that go well beyond household level interventions, the systemic level investments that someone else asked about, roads and things like this. So, yeah, I think that for me, we need to turn our attention to supporting governments, and it's part of the reason we wanted Ayan to help open this event, is through her role in EGAD and similar collaborations with SILS in West Africa, supporting governments to take advantage of these measurement techniques to make their own case to their own finance departments to continue to invest in this because they can't afford not to. The same reason we've been making here. Over.
And does anyone care to answer the first question on timing? Jose, maybe. No, you've been active in the Q&A.
I can take it. Let's say for the timeline, it depends on the nature of the intervention per se, right? So on that regard, it will depend on how long you will have to wait to see some sort of effect, and also in the assumptions that you're making on this intervention. But for the sake of the mapping exercise, definitely you will need at least 2 in that time frame that you are assuming that some sort of effect will appear or the effectiveness will take place. And in case you want to make it more complex, then you will need, let's say, more time for a shock to occur, which is not actually something that you can predict easily when it's going to happen. So for sure, there's a variety of situations in which this could take place, right? So I would say that at least, as we all know, we have been discussing here, you need 2, right? 2 points of observation to make some sort of a claim in terms of any intervention.
Simone, I can take a shot at answering that first question. And it's related to what Greg said. Ending drought emergencies, what the government has been investing in are infrastructure, water resources. They've been trying to strengthen county ability to manage disaster response. They've they've improved the social safety nets in these counties as well. So PREG fits into a broader program that the government is actually pushing. And in fact, PREG ended up working very closely with county governments on planning and work planning and trying to make sure that there was good alignment in terms of what the government was trying to do in those counties and what they were doing in terms of managing these shocks more effectively. Over.
Thank you. And then Pablo, you've had your hand up for a while, so we'll try to unmute you now, and then you can ask your question. Thanks for your patience.
Can you hear me? Because it's kind of fine, thank you. So thank you for the excellent presentation and thought-provoking discussions. All these insights on resilience impact assessment have been extremely rich, and I think they offer plenty of food for thought for all of us, including for our work in the WFP. And I'd like to briefly share some reflections from our experience at the World Food Program, particularly in this Sahel, where we've been implementing a large-scale integrated resilience program since 2018. And as part of this effort, we've adopted a coordinated and mixed method approach to resilience monitoring and measurement. And rather than relying on isolated indicators, methods, or studies, we build a regional evidence system that brings together household surveys, satellite data, outcome monitoring, and also qualitative research. And this allows us to capture the multifaceted nature of resilience, tracking changes not only in food security and livelihoods, but also in gender dynamics, social cohesion, ecosystems, and institutional capacity. And we've used this approach because we have found that single indicators or single methods assessment simply don't capture the complexity of the environments where we work in, especially in fragile, shock-prone contexts like the Sahel. So we think that those mixed methods are essential to understanding how layered interventions interact over time and to determine whether, how, and why we are generally strengthening resilience and reach long-term humanitarian needs. And we have recently conducted a study linking with what we have been said before on averted humanitarian needs, using the approach that has been jointly developed also with Tango, University of Arizona, and drawing over 37,000 household observation in 42 surveys between 2018 and 2023 across 5 Sahelian countries. We have applied the methodology adapted from FuseNet to compare trends in food insecurity among WFP-supported households with a control group using the cadre-harmonized data for general population. And we observed that while food insecurity increased dramatically across the Sahel, we have observed a notable decline among our beneficiaries, particularly during the lean season. And this is suggesting that more or less the model looks like up to 1 million people were prevented from falling into food crisis. So I think those approaches on averted humanitarian needs have been shown to be quite interesting to show the effects of these programs. And now, well, we're having initiated and now we are incorporating satellite-based analysis into evidence pieces through our asset impact monitoring system. And we are now looking also to complement these findings with in-depth qualitative research on key determinants of resilience. So we hope these efforts will contribute meaningfully also to broader discourse on resilience and how we assess its impact. So it was just to raise up these elements and align with what has been said before, and we think we are all in line and looking forward to see the results of our interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Does anyone want to respond to that? Please raise your hand, or you're also getting a bit short on time, so think about it, and if you want to share, then raise your hand and you can panelists. There was another question for Lisa and Tim. Was there anything from your research that also informed more strategic, long government willingness to invest in larger infrastructure projects in roads, water access, or other investments that prove these typically emergency response areas are now actually areas for investment. And Greg, I know you're also writing an answer to that one, but Lisa and Tim, do you want to respond? And then I think you also have a question from Mo and Michael. So question from panelist to panelist. Let's go for it.
I thought I already answered that one about the EDE.
There was a similar question.
Yeah, the government, in fact, I'm glad Pablo just talked. WFP has been very active in helping to build capacity of local governments to put in effective social safety nets, disaster risk response, but also coordinate a lot of the infrastructure that allows for resilience building to take place. So there's been, but the government itself has been very active in trying to promote the infrastructure in these areas so that resilience can be built.
And I just posted the Government of Kenya's Ending Drought Emergencies Common Programming Framework that shows the breadth of investment. And it's worth noting the Government of Kenya investment eclipsed all donor investment combined behind that plan. Maybe just briefly on Pablo's intervention reminds me, this isn't only true for WFP, but it's true everywhere we're working. One of the fundamental challenges, and it's not a resilience measurement challenge, it's a measurement challenge, is establishing counterfactuals, particularly when you get into these complex country-led programs that are broad in geographic scope, that operate at systems level scales. So it's one thing to do an RCT on a small set of interventions in a somewhat controlled environment, but trying to provide methods to generate these averted assistance needs numbers or averted losses numbers in these complex policy and programming environments that it's really the counterfactual ends up being super challenging. So I know one approach Tango's used is high and low intensity as comparison groups, and I think there's probably versions of that that could support governments. But I know it's a universal challenge when we get to that level of complexity. Over.
Yeah, just on that, if I could say just a word. I've been talking with someone named Alejandro de la Fuente, who's with the World Bank. We've been talking about how do you measure, how do you get your hand around national level shock responsive social protection systems. So in principle, you can kind of do this. The counterfactual gets a little fuzzy, but we've been bouncing around some ideas about, okay, we could look across countries, different countries that have had things, and if we can come up with a way to measure severity of shocks and sort of see, can you at a national level start to find indicators of quicker response, either by focusing on poverty measures, did a country with adaptive social protection that measures poverty at high frequency, as is the case typically in Latin America, can you actually start to see the imprints? I mean, again, I think we have to be careful. One of the bad things about the randomized control trial resolution, it has sort of turned truth into binary. It's either true or not true. And the reality is, of course, always much more. So I think there's a lot if we put our thinking hats on, I think there's a lot we can learn quantitatively. We can put bounds around how precise it is. But I think it's a real challenge, and I think it's absolutely important to start to monetize some of these things to make the point that it actually is better to act in anticipation rather than try to clean up the mess ex post, which is I think the key question here.
Thank you. And I think we have 1 minute left maybe. So let us just close here. I think I wanted to thank all of you, my panelists, for joining us today and sharing your experience and lessons and evidence. It's really been great listening to you, but also for the audience, of course, for joining us and for hanging on actually quite long into the Q&A, which is remarkable. I hadn't had a webinar in a while, so maybe it was enough of a pass for all of us, and it's of course a very interesting and important topic. So with that, thanks again. Thank you all. We will share the recording. We will share the slides. We will share supplementary materials. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to continuing this journey with you all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.